They were born without sight and learned to live in the darkness of the soul until the day the millionaire came home and saw the new nanny kneeling on the floor, doing something with the twins that no one ever had the courage to do. At that moment, the silence in that house ended. Arthur's mansion was a monument to silence, a fortress of mirrors and cold marble that reflected everything but the warmth of a home. Every hallway echoed with emptiness, each living room a pristine set, waiting for characters who never arrived. At the center of it all, a grand piano, covered by a silk sheet and a thin layer of dust, stood like a tomb for the music that had once filled these walls. Ever since his wife had left, Arthur's life had become a predictable, soulless script. His routine was an endless cycle of meetings about the performance of his stocks, phone calls to manage his vast portfolio, and protocol dinners where the clinking of silverware was the only sincere conversation. He was a man who had built a colossal fortune, a business empire that spanned continents, yet inside his own house, he was a king exiled from his own heart. The money that bought him everything could not fill the abyss her absence had left behind. The most painful proof of this void was his daughters. Clara and Sophie, 4-year-old identical twins, were like delicate porcelain dolls, forgotten on a shelf. Blind since birth, they navigated the world through a labyrinth of shadows and muffled sounds, but since their mother's departure, they had retreated into themselves. They spent their days in their darkened room, a sanctuary of memories that not even the strictest housekeeper dared to alter. They didn't laugh, didn't cry out, didn't ask for anything. Their movements were minimal, their whispers rare. They were living shadows in the house, a constant reminder of the joy that had been extinguished. Arthur watched them on the security cameras, their small, still figures, and felt the weight of his failure as a father. He knew how to multiply his capital, how to analyze the crypto market or invest in gold, but he had no idea how to reach his own children. Until, on a grey autumn morning, as the rain beat relentlessly against the mansion's bulletproof windows, she arrived, the new caregiver, Elena. She didn't bring an impressive resume or letters of recommendation from wealthy families. She carried a worn canvas bag, a smile that seemed to hold the wisdom of many lifetimes, and a small, dark, wooden box. Her face was not that of someone seeking to impress, but of someone who understood the language of pain and patience. Raised by her grandmother, a woman who practiced folk medicine and believed stories were the truest cure, Elena had learned that the world could be seen with the hands, heard with the heart, and felt with the soul. As she approached the massive door to the girl's room, she didn't knock. From her bag, she took out a small bronze bell tied to a leather ribbon. Instead of a sharp, authoritarian rap, she let it ring. 3 soft, clear, melodic notes floated down the hall, an unexpected song that cut through the house's oppressive stillness. Inside, in the silence of the room, something unprecedented happened. 2 small faces, until then turned toward the wall, rose simultaneously. Clara and Sophie's heads tilted toward the door, their sharp ears catching a vibration that did not belong to the house's known repertoire of sounds. Hurried footsteps, whispered orders, the hum of electronics. This sound was different. It was a question, an invitation. It was alive. And for the first time in months, a sound that was not of pain or command, but of pure curiosity, made the 2 girls, together as one, take a hesitant step toward the door. On the other side, Elena waited, the bell still vibrating softly in her hand, unaware that those 3 simple notes had just shaken the foundations of a world built on silence. The next day, the mansion's routine, once as immutable as the price of a blue-chip stock, was gently subverted. Elena ignored the printed schedule that Mrs. Gable, the grim-faced housekeeper, had left on the dresser. The paper detailed with military precision the hours for feeding, rest, and controlled sensory stimulation. a clinical term that sent a shiver down Elena's spine. Instead, she opened her wooden box, which to her was worth more than any treasure in gold. From inside, she took not expensive toys, but fragments of the world. There were scraps of smooth silk, rough wool and soft velvet. Small glass vials held the scents of lavender from the fields, damp earth after a rain, and cinnamon sticks. She didn't force the girls into anything. She simply sat on the floor with them in silence and began to explore the objects, describing in a low voice the sensations and the colors they couldn't see. "This blue is like the sky before a storm," she whispered, running a piece of cool satin across Clara's fingers. Clara flinched but didn't pull away. Mrs. Gable's presence was a constant shadow in the hallways. The housekeeper, a woman who managed the home with the same ruthless efficiency with which Arthur managed his assets and liabilities, watched the new caregiver with a sharp distrust. To her, Elena was an anomaly, a risk variable in a perfectly calculated system. The young woman's approach, based on instinct and affection, was the opposite of everything Mrs. Gable valued: order, discipline, and professional distance. She saw a dangerous naivete in Elena's smile and, in her methods, a door flung open to chaos. "The girls require structure, not fairy tales," she said, her voice thin as a needle, upon finding Eleanor and the twins sitting on the rug. "Predictability gives them security." Eleanor just looked up, a small vial smelling of pine in her hands. "So does trust," she replied, with a calmness that irritated the housekeeper even more. To Mrs. Gable, this was an affront, a breach of protocol that threatened the stability she prided herself on maintaining in the management of this vast domestic estate. In the afternoon, defying the light rain that was still falling, Eleanor did the unthinkable. She took Clara and Sophie into the garden. Mrs. Gable nearly protested, but something in the young woman's serene determination made her hold back, watching from the window with her arms crossed. Outside, Elena turned the garden into a living classroom. She guided the girls' small hands over the rough bark of an old oak tree, the velvety petals of a rose, and the cool, smooth leaves of a fern. "Can you feel that? Life has different textures," she said. It was then that it happened. Sophie, whose expression was always a mask of neutrality, touched a leaf covered in dew, felt the cold droplets on her skin, and for the first time in over a year, a sound escaped her lips. It wasn't a word, but something far more precious. A small, hesitant laugh. The sound was quiet, almost inaudible, but to Elena it was the most beautiful symphony. Clara, beside her, turned her head toward her sister, her face a picture of genuine surprise. The moment of pure magic was shattered by a sharp voice. "What do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Gable stood at the glass door, her face a storm of disapproval. "They could slip, they could catch a cold. This is irresponsible." Elena stood up, placing herself protectively between the housekeeper and the girls, who flinched at the harsh voice. "They're discovering the world, Mrs. Gable. They're safe with me," she answered, her voice firm but not aggressive. The housekeeper took a step forward, her gaze fixed on Elena like a predator. "Mr. Arthur entrusts me with the order and security of everything he owns, including his daughters. He built his immense fortune on calculation and the elimination of risk." She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the damp air. "One misstep, miss, one, and I will personally ensure you are out of this house by nightfall." The days that followed were woven with an almost secret delicacy. Elena, aware of Mrs. Gable's watchful eyes, didn't back down, but deepened her method of affection and discovery. She and the girls created their own code, a language that transcended the silence of the house. The three-note bell became the call for a new adventure. One ring meant the garden, two rings the texture box, three rings a story told in whispers. Clara and Sophie began to blossom under this care. Their shoulders, once hunched, relaxed. Their steps, once hesitant, gained a new confidence. They still didn't speak in full sentences, but their fingers became more curious, their smiles more frequent. Arthur, in his rare appearances, noted the changes with a mixture of relief and discomfort. He saw his daughters more alive, but this vitality was the work of a stranger, a woman who understood nothing of profit and loss statements or his business's cash flow, but who seemed to understand the souls of his daughters in a way he never could. This dependence frightened him. The fragile harmony was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon with the arrival of a foreign luxury sedan that slid silently up the gravel driveway. From it stepped Beatrice, Arthur's younger sister. She was the exact opposite of Elena, tall, impeccably dressed in a designer pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She exuded an air of clinical authority. A renowned child psychologist with a clinic frequented by the city's elite. Beatrice saw the world through the lens of theory and diagnosis. Mrs. Gable received her at the door with a reverence bordering on subservience, as if the true queen of the castle had finally arrived to inspect her domain. "Beatrice, thank goodness you've come. The situation is getting out of hand," the housekeeper whispered, casting a meaningful glance toward the garden. Beatrice merely nodded, her thin lips pressed into a line of disapproval. Before she had even seen anything, she hadn't come to observe, she had come to confirm her own conclusions. To her, her niece's upbringing was a long-term investment, and Elena was, in her professional opinion, a high-risk asset. Elena was on the lawn with the girls, teaching them to differentiate birds by their songs, when she felt a prickle on the back of her neck. Turning, she saw the two women watching her from the patio, two statues of judgment. Beatrice didn't approach. She remained at a distance, analyzing Elena's every gesture, every word, her cold, analytical gaze dissecting the scene. Elena felt like a specimen under a microscope. Her confidence, which had bloomed in the girls' company, withered under the scrutiny. She tried to focus on Clara and Sophie, but the pressure was palpable. The girls themselves seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, huddling a little closer to her. For nearly an hour, the silent examination continued. Beatrice offered no smile, no nod. She just watched, her mind cataloguing every deviation from what she considered proper protocol for children with special needs. Finally, with an imperious gesture, Beatrice summoned Elena inside. The conversation took place in the library, a room that smelled of leather and old money. "Miss Elena," Beatrice began, her voice polished but devoid of any warmth, "I appreciate your dedication. However, what you are doing is dangerously amateurish." Elena tried to speak, to explain about Sophie's laugh, about the daily progress, but Beatrice cut her off with a wave of her hand. "Good intentions are no substitute for technique. These children have suffered an immense loss. Their emotional state is extremely fragile. They need specialists. Structured therapy, evidence-based interventions, not bells and smells." She stood, walking to the window and looking out at the two small figures waiting in the garden. "You're creating an emotional attachment that is unprofessional and, frankly, unsustainable." Then she picked up the phone. Elena listened, paralyzed, as her voice grew even colder. "Arthur, it's me. We need to talk about this nanny. Special children require specialists, not some folksy curiosity. She has to go." Arthur's phone rang in the middle of a crucial meeting. On the screen, Beatrice's name glowed with urgency. He excused himself from his partners, men who spoke the same language he did, the language of compound interest, quarterly dividends, and strategic asset acquisition, and retreated to his private office, a glass sanctuary overlooking the pulsing city. His sister's voice was a scalpel, precise and incisive, dissecting Elena's every action, repackaging Sophie's laugh as emotional dysregulation, and the garden exploration as unnecessary risk exposure. "She's turning the house into a chaotic sensory experiment, Arthur. There's no method, no progress assessment. It's pure sentimentality." Beatrice concluded, her professional authority leaving no room for doubt. Arthur listened in silence, the weight of the business world still on his shoulders. He was a man who trusted data, reports, projections. What Beatrice offered was a diagnosis, a risk analysis. What Elena offered was something he couldn't quantify. He hung up the phone with a sense of nausea. The pressure to fire Elena was immense. Beatrice was the expert, Mrs. Gable, the trusted manager of his home. Both pointed in the same direction. The new caregiver was a destabilizing element, an emotional investment with no guaranteed return. His mind, trained to make logical, profitable decisions, told him to cut his losses, to hire a team of therapists recommended by Beatrice, to turn his daughter's upbringing into a manageable project with measurable goals and outcomes. It would be the safest decision, the one that would protect his most valuable assets from any further damage. He looked out the window at the cars, moving like orderly cash flow in the streets below, and the decision seemed clear. The cold logic that had made him a multi-millionaire told him to end it. That evening, Arthur arrived home earlier than usual, the termination speech rehearsed in his mind. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the heavy, oppressive silence of before. There was a lightness in the air, an anticipation. He walked through the polished halls, his expensive shoes making no sound on the Persian rug. The door to his wife's old music studio, a room he had kept locked since her departure, was ajar. A sliver of soft light escaped from it, along with a sound that made his heart stop for a beat. It wasn't music exactly. It was laughter, genuine, crystalline laughter from his daughters. He drew closer, his body rigid, his heart hammering against his ribs like an investor watching his stock plummet and soar in the same minute. He peered through the crack, invisible in the dimness of the hall. The scene he saw disarmed him completely. Elena was sitting on the floor in front of the grand piano, the lid open. Clara and Sophie were beside her. She wasn't playing the piano. With a delicate touch, she was simply pressing one of the bass strings with her finger, producing a deep, dull vibration. "Feel that," she whispered. "That's a low sound, strong, like a giant's footsteps." The girls, their faces lit with pure curiosity, placed their small hands on the piano's wood, feeling the vibration run through their bodies. They laughed, amazed. Then Elena touched a high string. "And this," she said, "is a high sound, light, like rain on the roof." Clara, the quieter of the two, tried to mimic the sound with a quick, sharp clap. Sophie giggled, trying to do the same. They weren't just listening, they were feeling the music, building a map of sounds within themselves. Arthur froze at the door. The termination speech dissolved in his mind. He saw not a folksy curiosity, but a woman who was, with infinite patience, teaching his daughters to see the world through music. That studio, once a mausoleum for his grief, was alive again. Unseen, he backed away, but the sound of that laughter followed him, echoing in his soul all night, a melody none of his riches could buy. Arthur's decision not to fire Elena, made in that dark hallway, was communicated not with words, but with a tense silence that hung over the mansion. To Mrs. Gable and Beatrice, his inaction was a sign of weakness, an inexplicable lapse in his judgment. The housekeeper intensified her surveillance, her eyes following Elena with a cold, calculated hostility. Every minor deviation from the routine was mentally noted, every laugh from the girls interpreted as a step toward indiscipline. Mrs. Gable felt her control over the house, once as absolute as the value of gold in a crisis, slipping through her fingers. Her loyalty to Arthur was fierce and possessive. She had seen him build his empire from nothing, turning a small seed of capital into a fortune few could imagine. In her mind, Elena wasn't just an inadequate caregiver, but a threat to the very structure of the world she had helped keep in order. Protecting Arthur's assets, in all their forms, was her life's mission. And she saw in this easy, smiling young woman the most dangerous of vulnerabilities. The tension became a thick, almost palpable fog. Elena felt it in the air, in the sidelong glances, in the whispered orders that ceased when she entered a room. But she refused to yield. Her strength came from Clara and Sophie's small steps of progress. The girls, once isolated islands, now reached for each other's hands. Their whispers were turning into hesitant words, forming short phrases. "Belle, please," Clara would ask. "Rain on leaf," Sophie would say, remembering the feel of the dew. They began to navigate the house more boldly, using the walls as guides, laughing when they bumped into each other. The music studio became the heart of the home, the place where sound took on shape and meaning. Elena used everyday objects to create an orchestra of sensations. The deep hum of the refrigerator, the rhythmic tick-tock of an old clock, the rustle of a book's pages. For the girls, the world was no longer a frightening void, but a vibrant map of sounds and textures. Mrs. Gable, however, saw only disorder and danger. Her methodical, risk-averse mind catalogued each new sound as a potential threat. The final straw for her came on a sunny morning. Elena had taken the girls to the studio for a sound walk. She had rearranged some of the light furniture, creating a small labyrinth for them to practice navigating by the echo of their own claps. It was an exercise in trust and spatial awareness. Arthur, on his way to a video conference about stock market fluctuations, paused for a moment, drawn by the sound of laughter. He watched from the doorway, his heart torn between fear and admiration. He saw his daughters, once static, moving with a joy he hadn't seen in years, but their joy was a risk, and risk, in his world, was something to be mitigated. It was at that exact moment that it happened. Clara, a little overeager, took a misstep and stumbled slightly on a small wooden step leading up to a platform where her mother's drum kit sat. She didn't fall. Elena, ever watchful, was right beside her and caught her instantly. The girl let out only a small cry of surprise, nothing more. But for Mrs. Gable, watching from a different angle in the hall, the scene was the proof she needed. She waited for Arthur to walk away, and then, her face contorted with righteous fury, she picked up the phone. Her report to Beatrice was not just a story, it was a formal accusation. She was almost seriously injured, the housekeeper said, her voice trembling with restrained indignation. The child nearly fell from the stage in the studio. It is unacceptable negligence. This woman is a danger to the children and to the stability of this house. The trap was set. The word negligence echoed in Beatrice's mind, and she immediately called her brother, her voice charged with an urgency that allowed no argument. "Arthur, that's enough. You need to act now." One of the girls almost tripped on a step in the studio. "This is exactly what I warned you about." The accusation landed on Arthur like a ton of bricks. Negligence. The word reverberated in his mind, amplified by Beatrice's authority and Mrs. Gable's unquestionable loyalty. His businessman's instincts, trained to identify and neutralize threats to his assets, went on high alert. The girls were his most precious assets, the legacy that transcended any value in dollars or euros, the possibility that they were at risk under the roof of the house that was meant to be their safe harbor was intolerable. He cancelled his meetings, his mind once focused on the profitability of his investment funds, now consumed by a primitive, fatherly fear. He drove back home in a state of cold fury, the decision already made. The experiment with Elena had been a mistake, a sentimental gamble that had nearly cost him dearly. Logic, method, and safety would once again reign in his house. He found Elena in the living room, sitting on the floor with the girls, who were playing with small wooden blocks of different textures. The scene was so peaceful, so dissonant from the catastrophe his sister had described, that for a moment he hesitated. But the image of the near accident, painted in vivid colors by the housekeeper, overrode reality. He called Elena into his office, the same place where he made decisions that affected thousands of employees and moved millions of dollars. The air was heavy. Elena entered, her face pale but her posture straight. She already knew. She had seen the triumphant look on Mrs. Gable's face when Arthur arrived. "Elena," he began, his voice harsher than he intended, "I received a disturbing report about what happened in the studio today." She tried to explain, her voice calm but with a tremor of urgency. "Arthur, Clara just stumbled. It was a small misstep. I was right beside her the whole time. She wasn't hurt, not even scared. We were doing an exercise," but he cut her off, his hand raised. "The point isn't what happened, it's what could have happened. A step, a moment of distraction. It's a risk I cannot take." He walked to the window, turning his back to her, unable to face the eyes that he knew would be filled with a disappointment he didn't want to see. "My sister was clear. Mrs. Gable was clear. My daughter's safety is my only priority. I appreciate your time and your dedication. Your payment will be deposited in full, along with a generous bonus for your services." The speech was cold, corporate. It was the language he knew, the only one he could use to shield himself from the wave of emotion that threatened to engulf him. Suddenly, a fragile sound came from the half-open office door. Clara and Sophie stood there, hand in hand, their faces turned toward the tension emanating from the room. They felt their world collapsing. "Belle," whispered Sophie, her voice trembling, almost inaudible. Clara, the shyer one, took a step forward, her small hands reaching into the void. "We want the bell," she repeated, her voice a little louder, a plea that cut through the air like a shard of glass. It was the longest, most complex sentence she had ever constructed. Arthur turned, his heart clenching in his chest at the sight of the genuine anguish on his daughters' faces. They weren't just asking for an object. They were asking for the one person who had given them back their light, the only one who had taught them to hear the music of the world. He looked at Elena, silent tears streaming down her face, and then at his daughters, who were trembling. The logic of his business empire collided with the undeniable logic of the heart. He hesitated. The man who never hesitated to sell a stock or liquidate a high-risk investment was paralyzed, for a reason he wouldn't dare admit even to himself. The echo of that laughter in the studio, the image of those small hands feeling the piano's vibration. He couldn't speak the final words. The dismissal hung in the air, and in that vacuum, Mrs. Gable, watching from the hall, felt the first real chill that her absolute power was, for the first time, truly threatened. The time following Arthur's hesitation was a suspended agony. The mansion, once a place of dead silence, now hummed with a quiet charged with hostility. Elena felt like a volatile stock, her value liable to plummet at any moment. Mrs. Gable treated her with an icy politeness that was sharper than any insult. Her every gesture an affirmation that Eleanor's stay was temporary, a miscalculation the master would soon correct. Beatrice called daily, her voice filled with a professional concern that barely disguised the pressure on Arthur to make the correct decision and protect his legacy. Elena knew her presence had become the epicenter of a conflict that was poisoning the air. For the girl's sake, she endured the stares and the whispers. But seeing them shrink back, sensing the tension the adults couldn't hide, she made a painful decision. She wouldn't wait to be fired. For Clara and Sophie's sake, she would leave on her own, removing herself from the equation so that peace, even a cold and sterile peace, could return. That night, after putting the girls to bed, she went down to the music studio. She wanted to say goodbye to the space, the only place in the house where joy had seemed possible. Moonlight streamed through the high window, bathing the piano in silver. She walked through the room, her footsteps echoing softly. Her gaze fell on the small platform and the wooden step, the cause of the entire crisis. Something bothered her, a dissonance in Mrs. Gable's narrative. Driven by an impulse, she knelt and touched the step. It was made of hardwood, but it was surprisingly light. She nudged it with her fingertip, and it slid across the polished floor with disconcerting ease. It wasn't a fixed structure. It was a movable object. A chill ran down her spine. She remembered the precision with which Mrs. Gable managed every inch of that house. Nothing was ever out of place. How could an object like that, a potential hazard, be left loose right in the girl's path? Unless it wasn't there by accident, Elena sat on the floor, her heart racing. The idea was monstrous, but it fit the housekeeper's hostility with a terrible perfection. She closed her eyes, trying to reconstruct the morning, the laughter, the movement, Clara's little stumble. She couldn't remember seeing the step there before they started the exercise. Her mind, a whirlwind of doubt, turned to the only other witnesses, the witnesses who saw with their ears. The next morning, with a calm she didn't feel, she took the girls back to the studio. "Girls," she said softly, "I want you to play a game with me. Let's remember the sounds from yesterday. Remember our sound walk." She led them along the path, then stopped near the platform. "When we were here, before Clara stumbled, did you hear any different sounds? A sound that wasn't our clapping or our footsteps?" Clara and Sophie fell silent, their small heads cocked, their faces masks of concentration. They were accessing their mental map of sounds, a file far more precise than any adult's visual memory. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Then Sophie raised a finger. "A scraping sound," she whispered. Clara nodded vigorously. "Like a box on the floor," she completed, and then, with her mouth, she made the sound that sealed Mrs. Gable's fate. A low, dragging sh, the unmistakable sound of wood being dragged across a hardwood floor. The step hadn't been there. It had been placed. Elena felt the floor drop out from under her. The housekeeper hadn't just lied. She had created the trap. Driven by a protective fury, she picked up the small wooden step. It was no longer a piece of furniture. It was evidence. She walked out of the studio, sweeping past Mrs. Gable in the hall like a hurricane, and marched straight to Arthur's office. He was on a video call, discussing the returns on his euro investments with his bank manager in Zurich. Elena didn't hesitate. She opened the door without knocking. Arthur turned, irritated by the interruption. But his anger dissolved when he saw Elena's face, a storm of determination and pain, and the wooden step in her arms. "Arthur," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the financial jargon coming from the speakers. "Hang up the phone. We need to go to the studio. Now, there's nothing for you to see. There's something you need to hear." Arthur, stunned by Elena's audacity, ended the call with a rushed apology. The urgency in her voice was undeniable, a note of pure truth that cut through the background noise of his carefully managed life. He followed her down the hall, Mrs. Gable watching the scene from a distance. Her face a mask of neutrality that barely concealed a rising anxiety. Once inside the studio, Eleanor closed the door and placed the small wooden step in the center of the polished floor. The silence was thick with expectation. Clara and Sophie, sensing the gravity of the moment, held Elena's hands, their small bodies serving as anchors of innocence in the gathering storm. "Arthur," Elena began, her voice low but resonating with a new strength, "I want you to listen. I want you to hear how your daughters see the world." She knelt in front of the girls. "Clara, Sophie, remember the sound you told me you heard yesterday before the stumble?" She looked at Arthur, whose face was a mask of skeptical confusion. "My ears didn't notice a thing," she continued. "My eyes were busy seeing what I expected to see, but their ears catch everything." She then turned to the twins and Tutti, with a gentle push, slid the step across the floor. The sound of dragging wood, The low, scraping echoed through the room. "Was that the sound?" Elena asked. Both girls nodded with solemn seriousness. "Where did you hear it?" she asked. Sophie extended a trembling little arm, pointing not to the spot where Clara had stumbled, but toward the hallway door. "There," she said. "Before. The sound came from there, and then quiet." Arthur's blood ran cold. The implication of those simple words was devastating. The step had not just been moved, it had been placed there moments before the accident, coming from the direction of the hallway where Mrs. Gable had been watching. The housekeeper hadn't been a passive witness. She had been the architect of the situation. The truth hit Arthur with the force of a market crash, annihilating decades of trust and loyalty in a single instant. The woman to whom he had entrusted his most precious possession, the guardian of his home, had deliberately put his daughters in danger to prove a point, to maintain her power. The betrayal was so deep, so calculated, that he felt the air leave his lungs. He looked at Elena, whose face showed no triumph, only a profound sadness for the ugliness she had been forced to expose. In that moment, Clara did something she had never done before. She let go of Elena's hand and walked, step by step, to her father. She didn't hold out her arms to be picked up. Instead, she raised her small hand and touched his face. Her tiny fingers traced the line of his jaw, feeling the tension, the cold skin. It was a gesture of pure comfort, an attempt to understand the pain she couldn't see but could feel radiating from him. Arthur stood motionless, overwhelmed by his daughter's tenderness and perception. In that touch, he felt the full weight of his emotional negligence. He had spent so long building an empire of things, focusing on his net worth, that he had forgotten to invest in the only capital that truly mattered, the love and trust of his children. Clara's touch was a margin call for his soul, a reminder that he was emotionally bankrupt. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and sliding down his cheek, wetting his daughter's fingers. The sound of that silent sob was the loudest the studio had ever heard. The storm, when it finally broke, was devastating but strangely quiet. Arthur didn't shout. His anger was a cold, precise force, like a laser. He left the studio, leaving Eleanor and the girls in the sanctuary of their discovery, and went to the living room where Mrs. Gable was standing, pretending to adjust a cushion. The confrontation was not an explosion, but a controlled demolition. "Pack your things," Arthur said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "I want you out of this house in 1 hour." The housekeeper paled, her facade of composure disintegrating. "Mr. Arthur, I don't understand. Has there been a misunderstanding? The nanny," she began, her syrupy voice trying to find a crack in his wall of coldness. "Don't say her name," he cut her off. "I heard the truth. And the truth is, you used my daughters. You used the trust I placed in you for 20 years to what? Maintain control, prove you were right." He took a step forward, and for the first time, Mrs. Gable shrank back, genuine fear in her eyes. "This house, this family, you were part of it, and you poisoned it." As the housekeeper retreated in defeat, Arthur made the second call, to Beatrice. He summoned her to the mansion under the pretext of a family emergency. When she arrived, she found her brother not in his office, but on the living room floor, building a tower of blocks with Clara and Sophie. Eleanor sat nearby, watching silently. The scene was so domestically unusual that Beatrice stopped, confused. Arthur stood up and, with the same deadly calm he had used with the housekeeper, told her everything. He didn't accuse her. He simply presented the facts, the sequence of events, the sound of the dragged wood, the unshakable testimony of his daughters. Beatrice's face went through a series of emotions, shock, denial, and finally a deep shame that flushed her neck. I trusted her," she stammered. "The diagnosis, the risk analysis, it all seemed so clear." Clear to whom? Beatrice? Arthur asked, his voice still low but weighted with his own guilt. To your theories? To your reputation? You saw my daughters as a case to be solved, a problem to be managed? You looked at them, but you never truly saw them. He then did something that shocked her to her core. I want you to apologize, he said. Not to me, to her. He gestured toward Eleanor, who looked up, surprised. And then, I want you to apologize to them. He pointed to the girls, who had stopped playing and were listening intently, their heads cocked. For Beatrice, a woman whose career and identity were built on being right, on being the authority, the demand was a crushing blow to her ego. Apologize to a folksy curiosity. The humiliation was immense. She looked at her brother, at Eleanor, at her nieces. She saw in their eyes not judgment, but a quiet expectation, and for the first time, the renowned psychologist felt the weight of her own misdiagnosis. Her theories on child development had no room for the wisdom contained in the sound of a bell or the truth revealed by the echo of a dragged step. Her face burning. She took a hesitant step toward Elena, the words of apology forming in her throat like shards of glass. Beatrice's apology was not eloquent. It was a short, choked phrase, delivered with her face turned to the floor. But for Elena, the sincerity was in the tremor of her voice, in the visible humiliation of a woman who had spent her life armored by her own certainty. Elena simply nodded, a gesture of acceptance that was also an act of mercy. Then Beatrice knelt, awkwardly in her expensive pantsuit, before her nieces. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't listen to you. Clara and Sophie didn't answer with words. They just moved closer and together, touched their aunt's shoulder, a gesture they had learned from Elena, a touch that meant, it's okay, we're here. Beatrice left without another word, leaving behind a silence that was no longer tense, but disturbingly empty. The enemies had retreated from the battlefield, and now Arthur and Elena stood alone amidst the rubble of their old life, with the monumental task of building something new. In the days that followed, Arthur tried. With the same determination he'd used to turn his first modest investment into a fortune, he dedicated himself to being a father, but he discovered that emotional capital was a market he didn't understand. The rules were different. The returns weren't measured in dollars, but in hesitant smiles. He bought expensive toys with complex textures and sounds, but the girls quickly abandoned them for the familiarity of Elena's wooden box. He tried to talk to them at meals, speaking of his business, of cash flow, or the legacy of knowledge he wanted to pass on. But his words hung in the air, abstract and meaningless in their world. He was a billionaire who could buy anything, but he was bankrupt in the only language that mattered. The frustration consumed him, leaving him clumsy and powerless. One afternoon, defeated, he sought out Elena. He found her in the garden with the girls, creating a map of scents with herbs from the small kitchen garden. He stood at a respectful distance, watching her. She was the manager of a treasure he possessed, but didn't know how to access. With a humility he never imagined he possessed, he approached. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice low, almost a whisper. I don't know how to talk to them. I don't know how to enter their world. Elena turned at the afternoon sun lighting her face. There wasn't a hint of smugness in her eyes, only a deep compassion. You don't have to enter their world, Arthur. You just have to stop and listen. Their world is already here, all around you. She stood. Come, I'll show you. She led him to the studio, the heart of this new universe. She asked the girls to wait outside and had him sit at the piano bench. Close your eyes, she said softly. He obeyed, feeling vulnerable and exposed. She took his hand, and he felt the warmth and slight roughness of her fingers, the touch of someone who worked with her hands, not with spreadsheets. She guided his hand to the piano's strings. Don't think, just feel, she whispered. She pressed a low string, and he felt the deep vibration travel up his arm. A wave of pure energy, then a high one, and he felt the quick, light tingle. He remembered the scene he had spied on weeks ago, but now the experience was his own. It was a revelation. For the first time, he understood. This world wasn't about what was missing, sight, but about what was abundant, sensation, texture, vibration. It was a different kind of wealth. Looking at Elena's focused face, the dedication shining in her eyes, he felt something shift inside him. An emotion that was neither grief nor frustration, but an admiration that bordered on reverence. A bold, terrifying idea began to form in his mind. "Elena," he said, opening his eyes, "to fix what I broke, to show everyone, including myself. We're going to hold a recital. Here, the girls will play for our friends and family." The idea of a recital, at first, seemed insane. Elena felt a knot of panic form in her stomach. To expose Clara and Sophie, so fragile and newly blossomed, to an audience of strangers. It seemed cruel, a spectacle of curiosity. But looking at Arthur, she saw not the arrogance of a rich man planning a social event, but the desperate sincerity of a father trying to build a bridge. He didn't want to show off his daughters. He wanted to validate their world, to give it a stage, to make it real and audible for everyone who, like him, had been deaf for so long. He wanted to repair the damage done by Beatrice's humiliation, by Mrs. Gable's betrayal, and above all, by his own cowardice. He wanted their three-note song, the one that had saved him from himself, to echo beyond the walls of the mansion. Elena understood the nobility behind the fear, and with a slow nod accepted the challenge. The preparations for the recital transformed the house. The news spread like wildfire through Arthur's social circles. There was skepticism, whispers that the eccentric billionaire was exploiting his daughters. Beatrice, hearing of the plan, called her brother, her voice a mixture of clinical concern and a new humility. "Arthur, are you sure? The pressure, the expectations, it could be traumatic for them." "They won't be alone," he answered with a calmness that surprised her. This time, he wasn't managing a risk. He was making an investment of faith. The preparation became a family project. Arthur cancelled all his meetings, delegated the management of his businesses, and dedicated himself fully to the recital. To his surprise, Beatrice, after her initial hesitation, offered to help, not as a psychologist, but as an aunt. She researched acoustics for sensitive children, helped choose fabrics to muffle unexpected noises, and even learned to communicate with the girls on their level, using objects and sounds. The studio became a haven of creation. There were no sheet music or formal lessons. Eleanor, Arthur, and the girls explored sound. They turned the three-note song from the bell into a more complex melody. Clara, with her delicate touch, discovered she could create sounds like raindrops on the piano's highest keys. Sophie, more audacious, used the palms of her hands on the bass strings to create a rhythm reminiscent of distant thunder. Arthur, sitting beside them, didn't teach, he learned. He learned to hear the space between the notes, to feel the emotion behind each vibration. He began to add soft chords, a harmonic foundation that didn't dominate but supported his daughter's fragile melody. In those afternoons, the money, the fortune, the stocks, everything that had defined his identity for so long, dissolved. He wasn't a multimillionaire. He was just a father rediscovering the alphabet of love, one note at a time. The rapport between him and Elena grew in silence. They communicated through glances, through shared smiles when the girls achieved a new harmony. It was an intimacy that needed no words, forged in music and shared vulnerability. On one of those afternoons, as the setting sun filled the room with golden light, the melody was finally complete. It was a simple piece, haunting and deeply beautiful. It was their story, the story of the house, the sound of silence, of pain, of discovery, and finally, of hope. The night of the recital arrived with a solemn quiet. The mansion's grand living room had been transformed. The lights were low and warm, the mirrors covered with dark velvet panels to soften the acoustics. The guests, a mix of business partners, family friends, and high society figures, sat in chairs arranged in a semicircle around the studio, its doors thrown wide open, revealing the grand piano like a sleeping creature under a single spotlight. The air was thick with an almost morbid curiosity. They had come expecting to see the eccentricity of a reclusive billionaire, perhaps an embarrassing spectacle, an expensive whim. No one expected what was to come. Backstage, in the small hallway leading to the studio, the tension was a living thing. Clara and Sophie, dressed in simple white cotton dresses, clung to Elena's hands. Their faces were pale. They could feel the presence of so many people, the warmth of their bodies, the low murmur of their conversations. It was an ocean of unknown stimuli. Arthur knelt before them. His heart pounded with the same violence as when he had risked all his capital on a single investment years ago. But what was at stake now was infinitely more precious. "Remember," he whispered, his voice surprisingly steady, "there's no one here. It's just our room, just our piano, just our music." He didn't look at Eleanor, but he felt her presence beside him, a source of calm and strength. She leaned in and rang the small bell she carried in her bag. 3 soft notes. The familiar sound cut through the girls' fog of fear. They took a deep breath, their small heads lifting. They were ready. Elena guided them to the piano. She did not sit with them. Instead, she stepped back into the shadows, giving them the stage. The girls, alone in the light, seemed even smaller, 2 fragile figures before the vastness of the piano and the silence of the audience. Then Clara raised a small hand and touched the first note, a high, clear note, like a drop of dew. Then Sophie answered with a low note, deep as the earth. The song began. It was not a conventional melody. It was a soundscape. Clara's notes painted the rain on the window, the rustle of leaves, the sound of the bell. Sophie's notes created the rhythm of footsteps in the hall, the beating of a heart, the distant thunder of pain. It was the story of the mansion, told without words. The audience, which had been expecting a disaster or a diversion, fell utterly silent. They were witnessing something pure, something money couldn't buy, and influence couldn't manufacture. It was the souls of 2 children revealing themselves through music. At the peak of the melody, something unexpected happened. The girls paused, leaving a note hanging in the air, and then Arthur rose from his seat in the front row, walked to the piano, and sat down between his daughters. And he began to play. He didn't play a melody of his own. He played the supporting chords they had practiced, the foundation that gave their music lift. It was his confession, his promise, his apology turned to music. It was the father finally joining his children's song. The sound filled the room, the harmony of 3 people becoming one, and there was not a dry eye in the house. When the final note echoed and dissolved into the reverent silence, for a long moment, no one moved. The audience was held captive, not by a performance, but by a revelation. The music had stripped away the mansion's walls, revealing not material wealth, but the ghosts of loneliness, the pain of absence, and finally, the stubborn beauty of reconnection. The first sound was a single, lonely sniffle from the darkness, then a hesitant clap which quickly swelled into a standing ovation, a tidal wave of sound that was, at its core, a wave of pure emotion. Clara and Sophie flinched at the sudden noise, but Arthur wrapped a protective arm around each of them, their bodies forming a small fortress of love at the center of the storm. He wasn't smiling. His face was wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. They were tears of redemption. He stood, helping the girls to their feet. They gave a small, clumsy bow, guided by their father's touch. Arthur then looked into the penumbra beside the stage, searching for Eleanor. She remained in the shadows, her eyes shining. He held out his hand to her, a silent invitation to join them in the spotlight, to receive the credit that was rightfully hers. But she shook her head gently, a quiet smile on her lips. This moment wasn't hers. It was theirs. It was the victory of this reunited family. By refusing the spotlight, she gave Arthur the greatest gift of all, the chance to be, in the eyes of everyone, and more importantly, in his own eyes, the father his daughters deserved. He understood the gesture and nodded, his heart overflowing with a gratitude that words could not express. Later, after the guests had departed, leaving behind a house that seemed to breathe again, Arthur found Elena in the garden under the starry sky. The night was cool, and he draped his jacket over her shoulders. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate for the immensity of what he felt. "You didn't just save my daughters, Elena, you saved me from myself. I've spent my whole life building a portfolio, accumulating assets, thinking that security was in the numbers, but the real wealth, the real return on investment, was here all along. And I was too blind to see," he paused, gathering the courage he'd never needed in any boardroom. "I've fallen in love with you," he confessed, his voice raw. "Not for the transformation, not for the miracle. I fell in love with your patience, your quiet strength, the way you heard music where I only heard silence. I fell in love with the way you turned the ruins of my life into a song." Elena's heart stumbled. She, too, felt something for this man, a tenderness that had grown in the shared silences at the piano, in the vulnerability he had finally dared to show. But fear held her back. She was a caregiver, an employee. He was a billionaire. Their worlds were too different. The expectations, the pressures, the ghost of suspicion, the accusation of being a gold digger still lingered in some corner of her mind. She hesitated, doubt clouding her face. And then, from the open patio door, came a familiar, sweet sound. 3 clear notes from a bell. Clara and Sophie were standing there, hand in hand, smiling in their direction. They couldn't see the dilemma, couldn't understand the complexity of adult emotions, but they could hear the harmony. And with that sound, they gave their blessing, their approval. The 3 notes of the bell were not a question. They were the answer. The purest, sweetest yes there could ever be. Months later, the mansion was no longer a marble monument, but a living organism that breathed with music and laughter. The mirrored surfaces, once cold, now reflected scenes of daily warmth, tactile drawings taped to the walls, colorful cushions scattered on the floor, and sunlight pouring through windows no longer kept shut. The garden, once a pristine and untouched set piece, had been redesigned. Small paths of pebbles, moss, and sand guided Clara and Sophie's bare feet, while bamboo chimes with different notes hung from tree branches, turning the breeze into an ever-changing song. The house, once a vault of painful silences, had become a giant musical instrument, and life was its melody. Arthur had discovered that true asset management was not on the stock market, but in cultivating happiness within his own walls. The most significant profit came not in dividends, but in his daughters' smiles. The most profound transformation, however, was Beatrice's. Moved by a mixture of guilt and genuine admiration, she had done the unthinkable. She used her capital and her reputation not to impose her theories, but to amplify Elena's wisdom. Together, they established a foundation. The mansion, once a symbol of exclusivity, opened its gates twice a week to host other families with visually impaired children. The music studio became a collaborative learning space, and Elena, now a respected educator, taught her methods, proving that the most valuable investment was in human potential. Beatrice funneled funds into formalizing the research, and what she had once called folksy curiosities was now the basis of an innovative educational program. The former psychologist finally understood that the greatest legacy she could leave was not in her net worth, but in the impact she could have on people's lives. The love between Arthur and Elena blossomed without high drama, nurtured by the companionship of everyday life. They would meet at night after the girls were asleep, not for lavish dinners, but to share the silence at the piano bench. He confessed, one of those nights, that for years he had measured his life by the growth of his fortune, but that the only chart that mattered now was the upward curve of joy in his home. He was still a businessman, a multi-millionaire whose decisions impacted markets, but the center of his universe had shifted. Wealth, he realized, wasn't about having everything, but about cherishing what was truly irreplaceable. The love of Elena and his daughters was his real treasure, the gold that didn't fluctuate with the market. The final scene of this transformation was not a grand event, but a perfect moment on a Sunday afternoon. The setting sun painted the sky orange and pink. Elena sat on the patio, reading a Braille book she had learned out of solidarity and love. Arthur was at the piano, the lid open, playing not a complex symphony, but the three simple notes of the bell, the melody that had started it all. The sound floated through the air and into the garden. There, Clara and Sophie, now 5 years old, were running on the grass, not with fear, but with the confidence of those who know every inch of their world by sound, scent, and touch. They chased each other, their laughter echoing, blending with the piano's melody and the sound of the bamboo chimes. The wind carried that song of new beginnings over the mansion's high walls, scattering it out into the world. In the end, Arthur had learned the most important lesson. True love isn't about seeing another with your eyes, but about being seen and heard in your own darkness, and letting another's light guide you home.